Our annual draft spreadsheet is complete, and with that releasing to the public, let's discuss the players the Bengals should be looking at for all of their needs in the 2025 NFL Draft.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow, joined today by Joe Goodberry, and today we dive into the annual draft spreadsheet that Joe is the godfather of at this point. Started as a project that he and I worked on, 2017, 2018, and have been completing every year since then with improvements coming along the way. We'll shout out the other major contributors to that project here in just a minute. But Locked On Bengals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find us on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcasts. Appreciate all the everydayers out there. If you're looking to become an everydayer, especially here in draft season, you can hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss an episode. We appreciate everyone out there that makes Locked On Bengals their first listen, especially if you've been doing it as long as this podcast has existed, going back to 2016. Joe, let's get into the spreadsheet. We'll explain what goes into this thing every year. We've got more players ranked than ever, nearly 1,000 players in a draft spreadsheet this year that we'll see 250 some odd players drafted, a fraction of the players that we've got in the sheet, but a huge project that is about to go out to the public, depending on when folks are listening to this. This can be a companion podcast to go along with the sheet that you'll see on Joe Goodberry's timeline at Joe Goodberry. I'll retweet it, of course, as well at Jake Liscow. But let's start with what the sheet is, Joe, and you can shout out all of the contributors this year because I know there are a lot of folks that have put a lot of work in.
Yeah, it's a team effort at this point. And I started doing draft rankings and doing draft content and draft work in 2010. So it's been a long time now. It's been 15 years of draft work. And then my first spreadsheet was 2012, where I'm like, all right, people want to see this go more in depth other than the top 50 or 100 players or whatever I was doing at the time. And I said, okay, based on film, and I used to watch all these guys in depth and watch as much as we could. And at the time it was highlights and cut-ups on YouTube, and I would score them, and I'd score them individually based on their talent only. And it would spit it out. And there was I had a lot of success with that with some guys, but I missed on a ton of players that later, as I got older and saw more data and saw more evidence that, hey, this stuff can be predictive, whether it's athleticism or production data. And then PFF got involved in the game in 2016 or so for college information. So I was like, okay, if this can help improve my process and help cut out some of the players I liked and say, listen, the data says this guy's got a small chance to succeed. It could be a Tyler Booker this year, right? Everyone loves Tyler Booker on tape, or at least likes Tyler Booker on tape. They understand his limitations, and you can be comfortable with those limitations because the tape is very convincing. You're watching a guy play football, and I'm projecting him to play football. It's very convincing stuff. But then you see, oh, he's in a bucket of players that rarely become better than average starters in the NFL. So now, how do you let that affect a guy's ranking or a score? And that's what we try to achieve. You'll listen to podcasts. If you're like me right now, you're cramming in draft podcasts, right? Listeners are probably doing this pretty consistently. Listen to everyone across the internet, and you'll get tons of film evaluations and opinions on players. Rarely do they marry that with the data. And the data is very important. Every team is using the data to help decide who is a good prospect, or maybe someone outside the box that they weren't thinking of before, highlighting guys or striking guys down, putting them on subboards, whatever it may be. Every team is using it to an extent, maybe some more than others, but the process here is to marry those two. And so that's what the draft spreadsheet does. And we started this, the first year you and I did it was 2019 for the Locked On Bengals podcast. We started growing it together and figuring it out together. And it was in its early stages, and we've changed the formulas and added players. And now I think we've reached 1,000 players. Thanks to guys like Neil Engelberger. If I can take a minute to shout him out, he is doing the heavy lifting. But then we have scorers and graders that take their time and watch the tape, like Max Toscano, Bengals Sands, Mike Santagata, draft guy Jared, and myself, and then a bunch of other guys that are filling in information and making it look pretty, collecting data, and just making the sheet consumable for you guys. And I'm very proud of it. it's a big undertaking, something we communicate on for a long time. And at the end, it's like, all right, we're finished. Enjoy.
The aesthetic upgrades from the first year we did this thing to now. I mean,
No doubt.
we were okay back in 2019. And I have my dates all jumbled there. So thanks for clarifying the timeline as I was trying to introduce it with dates that were very unclear in my head. But the aesthetics of this sheet have come a long way. It's still a spreadsheet, don't get me wrong,
No
but
doubt.
it's much prettier now than it used to be. And that's thanks to the efforts of all involved. And like you said, the point here is you can go anywhere and listen to what Dane Brugler thinks about guys on tape, or what Field Yates thinks about guys on tape when he's talking with Mel Kiper, or what your favorite draft analyst thinks on tape. Those are all written up. Lance Zierlein's top whatever, however many players he's graded are on NFL.com. And that's all awesome work. We use all of that stuff. That goes in to the consensus board that we track, right? And so we've got all that stuff in here. Mike Renner, name the draft expert that you like, who we've had on these shows in the past, whether it's Joe and I, whether it's James and I. And so that's part of the process. But while you have those on one hand, you also have people on the other hand that are like, okay, here's our analytics board, and it's only data. And the belief that we've always had is that you have to use all the information available to you, which even using all the information we have available to us is missing medicals, is missing character specifics. And those are things that are data to teams that we do not have access to when you're talking about sub boards, or where you have guys moved around the board for these different reasons, where you'd be comfortable drafting a player. That's data to teams that we don't have. But what we do have is an array of film scores from those film graders you talked about. Largely you, Mike Santagata, draft guide Jared, and then of course Max Toscano contributing for tight ends this year. And you can check out his project, Remember the Tight Ends, where he's taking it upon himself to really dig into the tight end topic as a position very deeply. You'll see that his grade for Harold Bannon is dramatically different from what you might expect when you go dig into the tight end tab, because he doesn't believe that Harold Bannon is a tight end. He thinks he's essentially Kyle Juszczyk. But the point of this is that we have all this data that over time has told us these are the things that contribute to the success of players in the NFL. And no matter how much you like a guy on tape, and let's continue to use the Tyler Booker example, guys that have that level of athleticism are rarely successful. And so what we try to do, and I remember we originally were calling this like the risk assessment draft.
That's right.
Or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. Because what we were trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, this is a player that's clearly a first-round player on tape, but for reasons beyond tape that we have quantifiable in terms of his athleticism in the case of Tyler Booker, in terms of his PFF data in the case of Tyler Booker, these are reasons that you need to be buyer beware. Or for a player like, I don't know, let's take Luke Kandra, 23-year-old. We also have in the past adjusted certain things for age. And so the whole point of this process is we're going to, over the course of this episode, dive into what the sheet says the Bengals should be doing for their top needs in a class that, if you listened to us 2 months ago, we would have said this is a weak guard class. And then you figure out all the tackles that can play guard in the NFL, that will play guard in the NFL. And all of a sudden, the guard depth looks pretty dang good. And that's where we're going to start as we dive into some of the players the Bengals can target at positions that are at this point severe needs after what they did in free agency. We'll start with what the sheet says about guards coming up next. This episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by LinkedIn, and LinkedIn knows that as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in, because when you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. And I would extend that to the Bengals and our draft sheet that we're talking about today. When you need somebody to do the extra work for you, just refer to the draft sheet in the Locked On or in the Cincinnati Bengals front office. But back to LinkedIn, they make it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. They've got a new feature, Post Your Job, where you can Get help writing your job descriptions and quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And the pro tip is add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Joe, as we dive into the sheet, there are obvious fits for the Cincinnati Bengals at offensive guard. You get some first round options, you get some second round options, you get some hopefully third round options. But I'll let you take it away here. Talk about what your takeaways were as you put the sheet together. What stands out to you as the best plan for the Cincinnati Bengals at guard?
Yeah, if we're just talking about guard, and we'll get to other positions here. I started like what you said before we went to break. Maybe not a great guard class until the weigh-ins happened and the measurements happened for the tackles. And it's like, okay, a lot of these tackles are going to play guard and they're going to get kicked inside the guard. And that's to me, the Bengals like to do that, right? That's not a problem for them. They want to move these guys inside. They want to have that flexibility or develop them and in a couple of years kick them back out. Or I think they like the size. They like the length a little bit more. They like the athleticism a little bit more. Those guys tend to play tackle in college and will kick into guard. So our scoring process spits it out, and it loves Will Campbell and Armand Membo. We don't expect either of those guys to be available for us. But right behind them is Kelvin Banks Jr. from Texas, the left tackle, who is 20 years old on tape. He's 21.1 on draft day. Super young, started all 3 years, 5-star recruit, played in huge games, and I think he looks like a guard. So one of the things is when you're watching tackles and you're saying, can they play guard? A little bit of difference between, in my opinion, between like a Josh Connerly and a Kelvin Banks is who plays with the leverage, who is comfortable in tight spaces, who is comfortable wrestling and digging guys out, especially defensive tackles, and moving them at the point of attack. And Kelvin Banks runs head first and slams into these defensive tackles that are 330 pounds. Kenneth Grant, put on the Michigan tape. And the data supports it. And the data says Kelvin Banks is a very, very good player. He gets an 84.3 grade. He's in our top 15 in this class. And if he's there at 17 for the Bengals, I think he's one of the best case scenarios they can land on in the first round. But after that, I think we do have a gap. And the spreadsheet agrees as well. Even though it likes Gray Zabel a ton, it likes Wyatt Millum a ton, who's currently 81st on the consensus, is probably supposed to go in the third round. It likes Jared Wilson a ton, despite him being a center. It thinks he could. Yeah, I think he can play guard at 6'3", 310. So the size there shouldn't limit him, but he's a third round pick. All of those guys I just named have first round grades, but it also fringe first round grades for Josh Connerly, Tate Ratledge, and I think Connerly can play guard, just not in the way that I think of like a power guard, like a Kelvin Banks to me could be a Pro Bowl or all pro level guard. I think Connerly is more of a Clint Bowling technician level guard. That's a good athlete. And then you'll eventually kick him back out to left tackle, but it gives a fringe first round grade to Connerly. Tate Ratledge, who one of the most commonly mocked players to the Bengals, same thing, fringe first round. If he's there at 49, take him. I know that some of these mock drafts have him available in the third round. I think they're absolutely nuts. I don't think that's going to happen at all. And then the last one there of the elite guys at the top is Arianta Ursary from Minnesota, who is a big dude, 6'6", 331. The problem with the evaluation of switching a tackle to guard is also, does the guy bend with his knees or does he bend at his waist? And for Ursary, he is a waist bender. So I wonder how the smaller, more powerful defensive tackles would probably work him a little bit and get underneath him and out leverage him. And I gave Ursary the lowest score on film than all these other guys I listed. So if you're wondering about Donovan Jackson, Jonas Savanea, all of these guys scored well enough to be starters in the NFL. After that, it gets a little slim, whether that's Charles Grant, Ozzie Trapillo, or Luke Kandra, guys that were probably third rounders, I think mostly. Kandra later, so we'll see where he fits in. He's probably the lowest scoring guard or lowest consensus rated guard that scores high enough to potentially be a starter in the NFL.
Yeah, Jalen Rivers reported 30 visit for the Bengals this week as well, coming in a little bit lower, although the film grades are probably fringe startable.
Mm-hmm.
He comes in a little bit lower because of some of the data there. What stands out to me the most about these guys is, of the fits that I like the best for the Bengals, Kelvin Banks in the first round or Tate Ratledge in the second round, those guys both are excellent pass blockers on top of everything else that you would hope for in a guard profile if you're spending a premium pick on that kind of player. The reason you would do it on Banks is because maybe you believe he can play tackle too. That's where the Bengals would have to be talked in to Kelvin Banks is, can this guy go on the Andrew Whitworth plan? Can he eventually be a good tackle in the NFL? Whereas Tate Ratledge in the second round, you're totally fine taking a high-end guard prospect in the second round. And both of those guys tested like very good athletes for guard. Like there's, you go look at the RAS column on the draft spreadsheet on the guard page, a whole lot of green, a whole lot of really high-end athletes for the guard position. But Ratledge and Banks both stand out in particular for their pass blocking prowess. So too does Wyatt Millam, although there's a bit of a different feel to that for me for some reason. I have a hard time putting my finger on exactly why that is. Maybe it's just a Senior Bowl and Millam having a tough time early in the Senior Bowl, holding his ground and anchoring, where you think about the traits you need for guard. You're talking about size and ability to play in a phone booth, but you're also talking about anchoring against these 350-pound, sometimes Dexter Lawrence, or 315-pound slippery guys like Chris Jones that you're going to have to deal with on the interior of an offensive line. And that's why, to me, the guys that have the clean pass blocking profile are the ones that stand out the most. And Jonas Savaiinaea is another one of those that has a strong pass blocking profile if you're looking a little bit later. Do you think that if they wait until the third round, they've waited too long based on everything that we've seen here? Or if it is Wyatt Millam, and that's the plan. And the Bengals haven't had any contact that we've recorded with Wyatt Millam. Another feature of the draft spreadsheet here is that we're tracking all of the contact the Bengals have had with these players. Millam is not one of the players they've had contact with. But if that's the plan in the third round and that's all you're getting, do you think that's too late? Or maybe you can get Jonas Savaiinaea in the third round? Maybe. I think that's pretty wishful thinking, although the simulator sometimes would have you believe otherwise. What are your thoughts on how things would go if they ended up waiting until the end of day 2?
Yeah, I don't know how many of these guys will be remaining. It's always a bit of a sticker shock, I feel, right before the draft when this is finalized, because these guys may grade really high, and then I go, oh no, I wanted this guy in the third round. I wanted Tate Ratledge in the third round. I wanted Charles Grant in the third round. He's a 90 percentile true pass set blocker. I want that. And then there's like reports, oh no, he's going top 50. He's going top. Everyone's going top 50 right now. There will be someone there. Hopefully it's a good player, right? Hopefully it's not just Miles Frazier, and Miles Frazier is fine. Hopefully it's not just Marcus Embo. Like if we talk about guys who did not pass the test on our spreadsheet, and we brought up already Tyler Booker, but Tyler Booker has to go in the top 50, right? So that's going to knock another guy down. But there are quite a few that didn't pass the bar. Anthony Belton, Garrett Dillinger, Miles Frazier, Marcus Embo. I don't want it to be one of those guys. I don't want to take another low-end bet on a guard just because they like him and he can squeeze ketchup out of a bottle, well enough for them, or whatever the handshake test is. That was Paul Alexander, if you don't remember. If you're a youngin', it was one of the reasons why they drafted Jake Fisher, maybe. I can't remember which one it was, but it was hilarious. Anyway, we have I go back to 2021. We had a lot of offensive linemen graded really well. This reminds me of that class where Sam Cosme's screaming at you, Creed Humphrey's screaming at you, Trey Smith forever was screaming at us. Quinn Minor scored super high for us. All of them had first rounder friends. They were all top 18 for us. I just looked at this, Jake. Creed Humphrey was top 18. Quinn Miners was top 18. Sam Cosme was top 18 on our sheet. They went with Jackson Carman, who we had a 5th round basically grade on in round 2. Don't do that and you'll be fine. Like of the guys available, if it is one of the guys that scores high, I have confidence that guy can turn into a decent level starter. Yeah. Just don't go off the map and you'll be fine.
Yeah, there's a couple things that we're asking for the Bengals to do when we're talking about guard. One is stay on the map, as you're saying. Like, don't go off reservation and do something crazy. And 2 is don't get to a point where you're desperate and that forces you to go off reservation. And I'm reminded, and this isn't anything about what McKinley Jackson did last year, but of the way that they ended up forcing those third-round picks last year, where we thought forever it was going to be Jalen McMillan. It ended up being Jermaine Burton, which was incredibly shocking at the time. But the likelihood of them taking a nose tackle last year was 100 in a bad nose tackle class. And so doing it in the third round was around earlier than we would have liked. But if you get to that point where you have a dire need and it's the third round and you haven't taken a guy, you're going to take a guy. And hopefully the guy that's left is good. All the more reason to make that move a little bit earlier. Let's continue with some of the other positions that we're expecting the Bengals to target in the draft and see what the sheet has to say to finish the show coming up next. This episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by FanDuel, and the NBA playoffs are here. FanDuel is then giving new customers an incredible way to get in on all the NBA action. Right now, when you place your first $5 bet with FanDuel, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if your bet wins. FanDuel makes betting so easy, whether it's picking your favorite team or diving into player props, whether it's the NBA and you're looking at three-pointers or steals or assist props, or you're looking at NFL draft props with the Bengals draft pick right around the corner. If you feel very strongly about what they're doing in the first round, you can go get in on the odds for the Bengals to draft a specific position in the first round with FanDuel. Plus, even after games have started, you can combine live prop bets into same game parlays for a chance to win big. Don't miss out. You get $250 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins at FanDuel.com to claim your $250 in bonus bets today. Joe, let's talk about some of the other positions that we expect the Bengals to address this year. Let's go to the defensive side of the ball, where there is a high likelihood, or at least a solid chance, that we should expect to see a whole lot of draft picks spent. An edge rusher, certainly on the menu. A linebacker, certainly on the menu. A safety, likely on the menu. An interior defensive lineman, almost certainly on the menu. That's a lot of positions that you're hoping to see the Bengals address at some point or another in this draft. And that doesn't mention the wild cards of potentially going after a corner, potentially going after a running back. But this class has been touted for its depth on the edge and on the defensive line in general. You go look at Dane Brugler's grades, for example, in the Beast, and you'll see more players in the top 100 on the defensive line than any other spot. The draft sheet, however, doesn't necessarily see it that way.
It does not. And then you're going to see guys that fall below the threshold. And we can start with defensive end and talk about like Shamar Stewart and Michael Williams. And you got to understand why. I think at this point, everyone talks about production, even if you're listening to film analysis or whatever you're watching or listening to. The production's bad for those guys. You need some level of sacks, pressures, tackles for loss, pass rush win rate, all of these things. It applies to the defensive tackles too, or guys that you'll see in the top 100. Dane Brugler, I believe, has Omar Norman Lott from Tennessee really high. He doesn't score well for us. Why? Because the guy's played 200 snaps per year in 5 years in his college career, at most 280 snaps. What does that mean he's going to be in the NFL? Typically, players are going to be exactly what they are in college in the NFL. They may get enhanced a little bit. They may get the microscope on them a little bit. Positive and negative. Their weaknesses will be attacked by the other team. Their strengths will be utilized by a good coaching staff. But at the same time, if Norman Lott is playing 250 snaps a year, where can you take that guy? 4th round, 5th round? They're telling me he can go 2nd, 3rd. I'm out on that. And I think the draft spreadsheet does a good job of saying that. It's also going to knock nose tackles and say you shouldn't take a nose tackle until day 3. Why? Because it's hard to project where the good nose tackles come from. The Bengals drafted Tyler Shelvin, and TJ Slaton was drafted 2 rounds later. Well, TJ Slaton was the better nose tackle, and that stuff happens all the time. But that is pretty common at nose tackle for these guys to come out of the 5th, 6th, 7th round and undrafted, because they need to be big body space eaters that aren't going to have a ton of production. So the spreadsheet's going to say that. But biggest takeaway for me is I think the DN class, even with taking out Shamar Stewart, Michael Williams, and saying, let's just not target those guys at 17, it's super deep. We're talking rounds 2, 3, probably 4. There's a couple guys in each round there that are going to score really high for us. Defensive tackle, it's almost the opposite. It's been touted as a really good defensive tackle class, but what do the Bengals actually need? They need pass rush, and they need a defensive tackle number 1 if they're going to do it. That means you've only got a couple guys. You only really have Derek Harmon, Walter Nolen, and our spreadsheet says, hey, keep an eye on TJ Sanders. But other than that, that's it. if you want a DT number one, those are your three guys. It has to happen at 17 or 49 if you're lucky that Sanders is still there at 49, and he's projected at the consensus right now 58th overall. And then after that, you may get a swing on a Deion Walker. Where's he going to get drafted? Third, fourth round. And you may get a swing on some rotational pieces like Darius Alexander or a Tonka Hemingway or a Jordan Birch, Simeon Barrow. Maybe it's Ty Robinson, who I've talked about a bunch. Maybe it's Aeneas Peebles. But half those guys fall below the threshold of becoming a good starter. So I think the D tackle class was a little bit overrated because most of them are going in the first round. Kenneth Grant, even Tyleik Williams is probably back end of the first round to the early second round. I think teams are going to love Tyleik Williams, but the DN class is strong throughout.
It's interesting that you mentioned the nose tackle bit, where this year we see that there are two really strong nose tackle prospects in Kenneth Grant and Tyleik Williams. And then you look at the guys that the Bengals have met with, and none of them are nose tackles. Even CJ West, where they had a presence at the Indiana Pro Day, probably seen more as a nose tackle than a versatile interior defensive lineman. And I think CJ West is a really exciting prospect. If you don't get a defensive tackle in the first 3 rounds and you have a chance to draft CJ West in the 4th round, I guess is probably the latest you would go, consensus 107 for CJ West. So that's probably hoping a little bit that he will still be available to you in the 4th round. I would think that would be a really good draft pick. And the guys the Bengals have instead paid their attention to are guys that are more penetrate 3-tech type of defensive tackles. And that is your TJ Sanders, your Walter Nolen, your Ty Robinson, Darius Alexander, Ty Hamilton from Ohio State on a local visit. Or Ty Hamilton in the 5th round, you could do worse.
Mm-hmm.
How much of a difference maker are you getting at that point? I'm not really sure. But if you're looking for that DT1 type, you're right. That's a first round prospect. Or TJ Sanders. Spend a second talking about TJ Sanders' profile here, because to me, and we talked about this before we started recording, if this is a draft where it's Kelvin Banks in round 1, TJ Sanders in round 2, one of the more exciting prospects that the Bengals could hypothetically draft at pick 49.
Yeah, and TJ Sanders was highlighted by the spreadsheet, right? I didn't have a film grade on him. It spit him out and said, hey, all the production and testing data, his data score, as we can see on the sheet, is the highest of all these defensive tackles at a 92. And I said, whoa, okay, let me go look at this guy. He's supposed to be a 2nd round pick. Maybe we're not talking about TJ Sanders enough. And I gave him a solid 2nd round, a premium 2nd round guy. I would target in the 2nd round at 78 on film. I thought he was first nearly 6'4", 297. And I think he weighed at 305, we mentioned before we started recording, at his pro day. So that's good size. I think he looks like a plus athlete. I didn't think he was an elite athlete, tested nearly in the 94th percentile. I thought good athlete, not great, but a guy who won consistently as a pass rusher and a run defender. I thought he was stout against the run. I thought he was disruptive upfield. I thought he could 2-gap just fine. To me, I'm watching him. I'm like, this looks like a good starting level player, but the production data puts him in the 97th percentile. And the PFF data puts him in the 85th percentile based on our formula. So you're saying everything is above average to elite levels. It spits him out as, hey, this is a guy we're too low on. And we've had this before. We've had 3rd round defensive tackles get top 12 grades for us. Justin Madubuike, Milton Williams. Right? These it highlights them. And sometimes on tape, I love those guys. Like Milton Williams, I loved on tape. Madubuike, I was more like TJ Sanders. I'm like, looks like a good player. Not sure he's great, but looks like a good player. I'd be happy with him in the 2nd round or so. Well, they turned into really, really good players. And because sometimes the data says if a guy was productive in college, he's going to be productive in the NFL. And that's what it's telling us about Sanders. And because of it, I'm in.
Checking boxes, right? Productive, athletic, and looks good on tape. Maybe not like a world beater on tape, but whatever he's doing on tape in the SEC is working. The other couple players I wanted to shout out here before we quickly get to safety and linebacker, Ashton Gillotti, I will one day pronounce his name right, who stands out as a massive gap between consensus and the sheets rankings, and Antoine Powell-Ryland out of Virginia Tech, a little bit older at 23 on draft day, but a guy that stands out again with a roughly early 2nd round grade when things are said and done, but is expected to be drafted on day 3.
Can I go quick on both?
We can talk about them another day this week. How's that? As we'll have a chance to get back to
a lot of fun to talk about those two.
We will come back to the edge position because I think that's one that the Bengals could target anywhere between rounds 1 and 5, depending on how things shake out. A position that you're either targeting early or late. On the other hand, I think is linebacker. Very top heavy here. Jahad Campbell with the shoulder question, knee question that was pointed out in the beast that you've talked about as well. And Carson Schlesinger from UCLA, the two guys that you could target early. And then some guys, Teddy Buchanan and Cody Simon in particular, standing out as potential late round targets that could be much better than their draft status, according to the data that we've got in the sheet. I would also point out, and the sheet does as well, Danny Stutzman, who's got a consensus 102, and Smail Mondin Jr., 113 consensus. Both of those guys, if you're looking for later targets, interesting. And the one guy the Bengals spent a 30 visit on that we're aware of, Nicholas Martin out of Oklahoma State, coming out like a solid player, according to all the data that we have. And that's a guy that you would be targeting probably in the 6th round. As far as safety goes, I think a lot more depth here that we will have to get into between Nickem and Worry coming out way high. Hunter Wohler, a guy that we're going to need to talk about as a guy that really stands out. The biggest gap between consensus and where the sheet lands on him since we've been doing this thing. Kevin Winston with the injury history there. Malachi Starks still looking like a good prospect, but really anchored a little bit by the athletic testing, even though we did this year alter the formula to count for athleticism a little bit less at safety because we have evidence that athleticism counts a little bit less at safety. But the sheet liking those guys, and then you see a little bit of a fall off before you get to guys like Andrew Makuba, Xavier Watts, who doesn't come out like a 2nd-round prospect on the sheet. What are the highlights there you want to hit on before we get out of here, Joe?
Yeah, so linebacker is very, very weird. You do have a 1st-round guy, you have a 2nd-round guy, and then I do not know. And I like the linebacker class, but you're right. Like Cody Simon and Teddy Buchanan, guys that are 5th, 6th-round guys, scoring very, very high. And I went back and watched. So I'm like, okay, and I'm in on both. Both are athletic. Both are consistently making noise against the run. Both are stout tacklers and seem very, very smart. And I'm like, okay, why are they rated so? I think we're struggling to rate linebackers as a whole. I went back and looked at drafting, and not just us, I mean the NFL. I went back and looked at who's been drafted at linebacker, and these guys are happy starters, good quality starters. We Bengals have had 2, Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt, 3rd round, 4th round, 5th round, and then role players. Smail Mondin is a tremendous pass coverage linebacker. He's going to go in the 4th round or so. He's a plug and play nickel linebacker, but he just might only be that. So there's a ton of these guys here that if they go in the right spot, they can end up being very good players. And I don't know which one the Bengals are going to target, but Jack Kaiser falls underneath. Someone we talked about it probably too much. Falls underneath the threshold. Maybe he still is a 5th, 6th, 7th round guy the way he originally was. And then at safety, we're going to keep talking about the same 6 or so players because that's it. And then it's going to fall off. But there are a bunch of guys I think can be starter level players. Jonas Sanker down to RJ Mickens and Jalen Reed, and they're right at the cutoff point, right at the line. But do we want to wait that long? And the Bengals have drafted guys like that with Dejon Anthony and Tyson Anderson. At what point there do you say, we've got 2 young guys we like. We're not going to stretch this into the 4th round and beyond.
I wonder if that's another one where it's early or late, like linebacker, where they're going to try to get one of those 2 maybe early if they can get Kevin Winston, for example, or then they come back and they go JJ Roberts late, or at linebacker, if they can get Jahad Campbell or Carson Schlesinger early, maybe they're in on those guys. But then if they can't, well, you got Nicholas Martin or maybe Barrett Carter later, although Barrett Carter is a guy that might go earlier based on consensus than the sheet would have him, a guy that the Bengals did meet with at the combine, where they're doing homework here on some guys, but it doesn't look like they're necessarily prioritizing early linebacker if you're just judging off their visits versus safety, where they've spent more time with some of those guys that are expected to be drafted early, and certainly a ton of time on the defensive line between edge, interior defensive line, a ton of time they've spent with offensive guard prospects, especially those that have experience at tackle. And so we'll have all of those things to talk about. We'll have to talk about running back a little bit, Joe, as we're going through this week, as we have a couple more days where it'll be Joe and I here on Locked On Bengals, and we'll have plenty to talk about as we're gearing up for the draft and trying to identify what players do we think the Bengals should be targeting in the 1st round. Where can we make a case for these are the guys the Bengals should be honing in on? And I always like playing the choose your adventure game, trying to come up with a number of scenarios, stack them up against each other, figure out the pros and cons, and figure out which scenario of which players in which rounds feels the best. So that'll be coming your way the rest of this week here on Locked On Bengals. We're, of course, keeping our eye on any further top 30 or 30 visits, as well as the Bengals might have some last-minute visits that indicate who they're thinking about in the 2025 NFL Draft. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.